Welcome to the University of Oregon's Live and Learn faculty presentations hosted by the Summer Academy to Inspire Learning, the SAIL program. For those of you who are unfamiliar with SAIL, we are a pre-college program aimed at inspiring the pursuit of lifelong learning within middle and high school students. Check out our free school year and summer programs. But today we are honored to host Grant McDermott from the University of Oregon's Economics Department. Grant is an assistant professor of economics, and today he'll be talking about economics and the environment. His area of research is in environmental and resource economics, which is the interaction between human and natural systems. And alongside his regular research, Grant promotes better coding practices among social scientists and advocates for open and reproducible science, as well as open source software. We are excited to hear more. If you have any questions during this presentation today, please enter them into the chat at any time. Grant is excited to answer questions throughout the presentation. We are excited to have you all. And Grant, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. I'm really stoked to be here. I'm a huge proponent of SAIL. This will be the first time I'm giving this presentation remotely, but I look forward to your questions. So I'm going to share my screen here. It's going to take a little bit of time to think, and then we'll get started with today's presentation. In the meantime, I want bonus points for the first person to guess my accent. You can put that into the chat, and full marks if you get that right. Okay, so let me know who gets that correct. So I'm going to give you an overview presentation on just kind of some broad ideas and of economics and the environment. You know, a lot of the times we think these two concepts are in opposition, at least the way they're framed in the media. And a lot of political discussion. I hope to convince you just with a few examples that that's not necessarily the case, and that these two different paradigms, economics and environmental protection, that they need each other, and they have a lot to offer each other. So, okay, the first thing about me, I don't know, I haven't seen this pop up in the chat. I don't know if anyone's got my accent, but I'm originally from South Africa. And I've been, as I was saying before we started streaming, I've been pretty itinerant. I've been all around the world and lucky to be now in the University of Oregon. And before I became a prof, I did, I worked for quite a long time. I traveled, so I did this big cycle across Africa. This is just in the Blue Nile Gorge. This picture used to be more impressive when I was clean shaven. I've grown a bit of a pandemic mustache, so it's not looking as much of a contrast. But I put this image here for a couple of reasons. One is because my decision to go back to grad school, to go back to school and to go to graduate school is motivated by a lot of the things that I encountered on this trip and on other things. And I was interested in this, thinking about individual incentives and how that's led to environmental degradation or environmental protection. And so it's been a good journey for me. The other thing I want to say is that I'm very much an accidental academic. So a lot of professors that you might meet, they knew coming out of the womb that they were going to be sitting in front of a classroom. I wouldn't have believed it even 2 years before I started grad school. And so I tell that because I think I'm trying to convince you that I'm a little bit sympathetic to people who are maybe not used to coming to an academic environment or thinking about university and all those sort of things. And well, if I can make it, you can certainly do it, because I'm pretty sure you're smarter than me. So here are my goals for today. I want to introduce you to some key ideas in environmental economics. I want to show you maybe one or two examples of the stuff that I'm working on. And I'm happy to talk about other projects, but again, I'm just trying to give you a flavor of what someone in my position does for research. And as we said earlier, I'm very happy and I encourage you to ask questions along the way. And hopefully there's a fourth implicit goal here, that we have some fun during this presentation. So just to kind of get our brains thinking about this, I want to start asking some hypothetical questions. And this is a little bit tricky because we're not in the normal interactive direct classroom environment. But again, feel free to put some answers in the chat here, and I'm just going to kind of talk through the way we think about these questions. So the first question is, how much is and I'm missing a bear here, not how much is a polar worth, how much is a polar bear worth? We see these heart-rendering images of loss of habitat for a lot of species due to climate change. And polar bears are capstone species. They have an emotive effect on us. They are these majestic creatures, and they're on the front lines of climate change. The Arctic areas are melting much faster, are heating up much faster than other parts of the globe. So we need to think about how much of society's scarce resources we're going to put away to combat this scourge, this problem of climate change. And in order to do that, we need to think, how much should we put away? So normally I ask this question in class, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people will say, well, they have this gut feeling that it's priceless. We can't put a price on nature. And I think that's an understandable response, but we want to avoid that response in economics, because that just seals off the discussion. And what economics does, I think, is it brings to the front of our minds that there are trade-offs involved, and we need to think about how to weigh up those trade-offs in allocating scarce resources for society. So if we decide that each polar bear's life is infinitely worth, is worth infinite dollars, then that means we won't build children's hospitals or aid shelters. I'm using deliberately provocative examples here, but so part of environmental economics is really trying to get to that hard job of putting a monetary figure on polar bears. And we do things like we run surveys, we think about knock-on effects and cascades through our ecological system and so forth. So that's one question. Another question is it good to buy local? So here's a picture taken from our local in Eugene Lane County Farmers Market. It's a great event. It's very communal, and I'm sure everyone from every society outside of the one that we live in has some form of this, where people are encouraging their local community and citizens to buy local. Now, there's many good reasons you may want to buy local. You may want to feel part of the community. You may want to establish a rapport with the person who grew your produce. But I asked this question, again, I'm being a little bit provocative here, and I want you to think about the environmental consequences. Now, I don't know if there are any answers in the chat so far, but almost always when I ask this question in a classroom environment, someone will say to me, yes, it's better to buy local from an environmental perspective because there's fewer CO2 emissions, bringing that food to our table effectively. And that's true. There's something to be said for that. But it turns out that when you actually quantify the numbers about how polluting and how much impact there is on our environment, it's often much better to grow those resources in faraway places that are optimized for growing them. So New Zealand, for example, is on the other end of the world, but they have an extremely out of proportion agricultural sector because they have what we would say in economics, very rich endowments. And so they can, grow sheep and all sorts of other produce with just basically using the natural amenities that are available to them. Whereas if we have to try and mimic that same stuff, that same agricultural system in other parts of the world, we have to use a lot more resources to simulate the same natural environment. So we may have to use a lot of petroleum-based fertilizers, for example. And so those are naturally polluting. And we may have to use a lot of other energy, whether it's mechanized or machinery and so forth. And so you add up all these things, it turns out that it's not necessarily better for the environment to grow locally, to buy locally. Now, again, I'm not saying at all that you shouldn't do that. I buy a lot of my food locally for the reasons I have already discussed. I like to feel part of my community and so forth. But again, I think what the economics is trying to teach us here is that we shouldn't just rush to a snap judgment about whether certain things are good or bad, at least along specific dimensions. And so here's a final provocative question. If fighting pollution is expensive, can we have too little pollution? And I'm being doubly provocative here because I've got this image of the smokestack coming out of a power plant, which is, you know, just insanely polluting and will almost certainly cause amazingly deleterious effects to those people that are nearby this coal station. Asthma, Alzheimer's, all sorts of things that are associated with local air pollution. But again, I think it's true that this second half, this second part of the question is true, I should say. So yes, again, because we have to think about trade-offs and scarcity, we can spend too much money fighting pollution versus other things. And so there's one way to stop all of pollution in society. We could just stop all industrial activity. We could enjoin all industrial activity. And of course, that's quite a silly thing to do, because then many of the other things that we care about, developing vaccines, providing shelter for our communities and our families, would be very hard to do. So there's a lot of economics teaches us, I think, to think about some of the nuances as well as incentives in trying to protect this thing that we care a lot about, which is the environment. And we'll also discover, for example, if you took my course in environmental economics, we think about how bad outcomes at the societal level are the natural result of bad incentives at the individual level. So people don't pollute because they're necessarily bad people, or even power plants, necessarily because they're bad companies or firms, but just because the rules of the game aren't set up in such a way that they want to produce the right level of emissions from a societal perspective. Okay, so the environment is super important to us from an economics perspective, because it's where we get all of our material from, all of our raw material. It's also a sink where we have to dispose of it, where we have to pollute. But economics is important for the environment because it really crystallizes this idea of, you know, if we must align individual incentives with societal outcomes to achieve our goals. And it also makes us aware of the trade-offs involved in deciding the just and correct and optimal societal outcomes. Okay, so this point in the class is normally where we'd rush off and do an in-class common pool resources game. Now, unfortunately, we won't be able to do this with the setup we have now, but I will make these slides available to you. And then hopefully afterwards, and anyone else watching this YouTube, this video, can have access to this. And I'm going to have a link here for a interactive game that you can play. And it's going to take you to this site, economicgames.com, and you can play this common pool resource game. It's going to be, they're going to call it the Tragedy of the Commons. After you do that, or even if you don't have time to, I'd like you to watch the short 5-minute video from the folks at TED, which is going to crystallize a lot of the ideas that you would have encountered playing this game. But the idea here is pretty simple, and I'll just summarize it. And again, if you're watching this after the fact and you know you have time to do the game, pause now. But the idea here is that what happens at an individual level and the incentives that we face aren't necessarily optimal from societal level. And so if we're fishing in a pond with a group of our neighbors, it may be the case that, you know, if we're trying to maintain optimal production of fish, how we could pull out all the fish, but then they won't breed enough, and pretty soon there's going to be nothing left. So we try and harvest our fish sustainably. But the problem is each individual has an incentive to extract just a few more fish than would be societally optimal. And that creates this race to the bottom. It leads to a downward spiral where I see, oh, my neighbor's got that incentive. I better fish harder too, so I don't lose out. That reinforces what I'm going to do, what I feel the urge to fish more fish than I should, and creates, again, this kind of downward spiral where pretty soon we end up with no fish at all. So again, this is much more effective, I think, if you've actually played the game, or at least if you've watched the video. So please do that afterwards, and you'll get a sense of this notion of the tragedy of the commons. So I'm going to talk now about some actual research that I've done. I'm going to focus mainly on 1 or 2 projects. Again, it's not the be-all and end-all of the research that I do, and certainly not the be-all and end-all of the research that happens here at the University of Oregon. But again, it's just a flavor of how someone in my position thinks about their job. So the paper that I'm going to talk about is called the Blue Paradox. Now, I'm going to start off by setting the stage here. I'm going to show you a real-time map. This is in the equatorial Pacific, just sort of northeast of Australia. Australia would be down here somewhere. And all these bright spots that you see here are real-time fishing activity. I'll talk a little bit in a second where we get this information about the fishing activity. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to concentrate on this kind of funny, almost polygon here, this almost square polygon. This is a marine reserve, and a marine reserve you can think of like a national park at sea. And I'm going to show you a period of time where this area, by the way, is called PIPA, the Phoenix Island Protected Area. And I'm going to show you that when they actually established this, or when they made it a marine reserve. And what you're going to see is that all the fishing activity inside of this reserve magically disappears. So we can see it's had this amazing effect. Okay, so let's press play here and let's watch this. So again, you can see all the fishing activity in this little area here. Now wait for it. It's going to go into place right about now. And again, you see this very clear, very stark effect. This marine reserve certainly had its intended consequence, which is that it stopped fishing after it went into play. And this has been a very celebrated marine reserve. It's been very well studied for many correct reasons. But like a magician or a ninja, I slightly misled you and I distracted you, because what I want to focus on is the period before it actually went into play. And this is something that maybe economics will teach us to think about that's not so obvious from other fields. So let me set that up in a little more depth. So the motivation for the project was as follows. Let's say you are a fisher in this area, the Phoenix Island Protected Area, and suddenly you hear that in a year, you are going to lose access to this fishing ground. So you know that they are going to seal it off, and from then on, you won't be able to fish. This is very similar to the idea that, if you don't eat all of your cake today, your mom's throwing it away. What do you do? Well, I'll tell you what I would do. I would try and catch all of the fish while I still can. So the idea here is that while well-intentioned, policymakers may have inadvertently created a perverse incentive. They may have created an incentive opposite to that which they wanted to achieve. They wanted to protect this pristine, beautiful area in the Pacific, but by telegraphing, by announcing with good intentions that they were going to create this marine reserve, again, think about it as a national park at sea, suddenly everyone tried to get in there and try to fish everything while they still could. At least that's our hypothesis. So how do we look at this? How do we actually study that data? And the answer is with something called Global Fishing Watch. Global Fishing Watch is a really cool project started by Google and a bunch of non-profit organizations, in particular one called SkyTruth. And it offers unprecedented insight into global fishing activity. And the really cool thing that I want to emphasize now, and this is true of environmental economics generally today, is that we are using satellite data to gain insight into previously inaccessible places. So areas that before used to be out of sight, out of mind, thousands of miles of mainland coastlines, we now have access to using satellite data. And this is true for things like deforestation. We have satellites constantly going overhead, looking down, seeing deforestation deep in the heart of the Amazon. And we can track this real time, or we can track environmental change in real time. So as I said, I'm a huge fan of Global Fishing Watch. And something that's really cool, I think, for students and high school students in particular, is that they really try and encourage citizen science and engagement. And one example of that, so that map that I just showed you on the previous slide, well, they have an interactive map over here, and you can log on to this. Again, I'll make these slides available, or you can just go to globalfishingwatch.org. And if I go here, I can kind of move all around. I can zoom out, and I can track fishing activity in real time. So I can see the whole of the globe here. I'm going to zoom in a little bit because it'll make it a little bit slow otherwise. And then I can, pick a certain point. I can go maybe here I'm in South America. Let me go to my home area of Cape Town in South Africa. So here I am in South Africa. I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and we're going to see after the map has time to think for a little bit, different fishing vessels begin to populate this. And I can move this cursor in real time. And each of these points is a fishing incident. And we can immediately see some interesting things here. We can see that if this map is clear enough to you, there's a boundary outside the country. This is called the EEZ. This is basically 200 kilometers from the South African coastline. Every single country has one. And then only vessels that basically belong to South Africa are allowed to fish within here. So what do foreign vessels do? We say they fish the line. They're fishing very close to this EEZ, and they're sticking just outside of it. And again, what I love about this map is you can see the ocean breathe. And I can click on an individual vessel here if it's going to let me. Oh. I can click on an individual vessel, and it would highlight that one for me. And again, in real time, I can track its movements. I can see all the different places that it fished over here. So this is really cool stuff. This is available to you free. You don't have to pay a subscription or anything like that. And I would just encourage you, you can just sit in front of this map, stare at it, and pick out interesting trends. And that's basically why we came up with our idea for the Blue Paradox. A fun fact, which may interest students again, is that the graphics technology that's used to power this map that I just showed you is the same that's used in leading video games like War of Warcraft. So again, there's cool technology coinciding with environmental policy over here. Now, there's a lot of data, millions upon millions of observations being added all the time. So as I say, we're gaining this unprecedented insight into our ocean. And there's sister projects of Global Fishing Watch. There's Global Forest Watch, for example, which is covering deforestation. And so again, just Google these or search them on the internet, and you'll see a lot of really cool things like this. And you can, just looking at this map, you can immediately see the tracks of vessels in real time, certain protected areas, etc. So we have all this data, and the data come from something called AIS, Automatic Identification Systems. Ships use these for navigation. And so they basically use it because they don't want to crash into other ships. So they broadcast their positions, and they want to make sure that no one else rams into their hull. And so what Global Fishing Watch has done is they've collected all of that data, but then this includes ships that are not just fishing, of course. It includes fish that are transporting, their oil tankers or their cruise ships. So one of the really hard jobs of Global Fishing Watch was to then take this raw data that you see on this map here and then convert it into usable insights. Like, how do we know that these vessels are actually fishing? And what they do basically is they use something called machine learning. So machine learning's been a hot topic recently. I think there's a lot of mystifying jargon about it. And I just want to dispel some of that jargon, because while it's technically very impressive and you need a lot of data, really what these algorithms are doing is mimicking something that you would do naturally. You and I would do naturally. We're just trying to mimic the same process that we humans use to identify patterns. So here's an example of that. Here are 3 different types of fishing vessels. And then so we see them on the bottom here. These are what the vessels look like. And then we see the paths that they're carving on the map. So this is, again, tracking in real time how these boats are busy moving through time and space in this Global Fishing Watch data set. So let's take the purse seiner, for example. The way the purse seiner fishes is they lay these nets down. And so you can see that the purse seiner is drawing the circular figure over here. So what they do is they move on one side and they lay the nets down, carry around, and then they pull the net in. And so again, if I explained this pattern to you of this circular motion and I told you what a purse seiner was doing, And, you know, a trawler, for example, is doing something quite different. Trawler is literally dragging a huge rake effectively with a net on the bottom of the sea floor like this, and they have to move in these kind of distinct directions. And a long line is similar. They lay out these long lines with lots of baits and hooks, and then they go back and forth collecting them after the traps have been set or the hooks have been set. So if I showed you these patterns, and we can see, each of us can see that they are very distinct, I could show you some new ship tracks, and I'm pretty sure that within short order, you would be able to identify the different types of fishing, even if you weren't a fishing expert. And so all that these machine learning algorithms are doing is basically mimicking that same process that we use to recognize patterns. They can see changes in directions. They can see how fast these boats are going. The key difference between, using a machine learning algorithm on a computer versus, hiring a bunch of students to look through this all is that, of course, the machine learning algorithm is much more scalable. We can just throw tons of computing power at it, and we can let it run on one of Google's servers, and it's able to pull in all this information. And it can, so again, hopefully you've got the point. You do need a lot of information, and there's lots of clever ways that machine learning companies and organizations do to get this. As an aside, I'll mention, I'm pretty sure many of you will have encountered something when you go to a website and you click on it, and up pops this form with a little grid on it. It says, prove you're not a robot by selecting all the traffic lights. And you're like, oh God, select all the traffic lights. And about 3 years ago, or 5 years ago, I should say, it was a form would pop up, and instead of traffic lights, it would be like, select all the numbers in there. And it would invariably be a picture of a roadside number, like a house number or something. Now, I'm going to ask this question. I don't know if anyone can answer in the chat box. What was special about, house numbers or building numbers? So the plaques that you would see there. And now, what is special about traffic lights? And motorbikes is another one I've seen come up a lot. Why do we always have to answer this question? I don't know if anyone wants to venture an answer in the chat quickly.
It takes a couple minutes for that to pop in there, and we do have quite a few other questions. But somebody just said they put that in there to make finding things easier.
Okay, for some reason I am not seeing the chat.
Oh, you're not? Okay.
No, I'm not sure. Sorry, I've got my chat open here, but it's not popping up. But okay, so Laura, feel free to relay those. So say the first question for me again. Sorry, the first answer that you said there.
Oh, so the answer to your most recent question was just to make finding things easier. Is how they answered.
So that. I agree. It's to make finding things easier. And there's maybe the deeper point that this person is getting to. But what I was asking, why specific traffic lights? Why not pictures of teddy bears or, I don't know, desks and trees? And the reason is that Google and whoever else is commissioning this, these, we call them capture boxes, is using us to train their machine learning algorithm. So what's been one of the major technological developments of recent times? It's been self-driving cars. What's one of the things self-driving cars, what are some of the things that self-driving cars need to be able to recognize? And again, they've got a machine learning algorithm running constantly. It's sucking in audio and visual from different sensors and cameras on the car. What do they need to be able to do? Well, they need to be able to identify when there's a red, when there's a red traffic light, and they need to identify the difference between a traffic light and some other light that looks similar. And so there's a clever trick that these companies have used, that when you go up to click, prove you're not a robot, in fact, the image that you have, there's probably on average only 30% of the blocks are actually known to be of a certain type. So they know that this is not a traffic light, and they know that this one is. The rest of them, you are actually volunteering information for the first time. So again, it's a clever idea, and you need lots of information to run these machine learning algorithms effectively. And so all of us, when we are going on there, we're busy training Facebook and Google's machine learning algorithm behind the scenes. This is the same idea when you go onto Facebook and it says, is this person Jane? And you click on them and you say their name. You are effectively training their algorithms to better recognize photos. Okay, so again, that's an aside, but I think it's an interesting one, and to show you some of the ways that almost unbeknownst to us, these machine learning and artificial intelligence have populated our everyday lives.
So Grant, another question for you is, when you are collecting all of this data, what are you doing with this data you collect to be able to how are you making a direct impact with the environment?
Okay, so I'll say that I'm not collecting these data here. This is Global Fishing Watch, which is collecting all the data. And in fact, they've collected them from private companies. So let me take a step back with this AIS information, with these transponders on these ships. So these ships send these messages out into the world, and anyone who's got a responder on the other side can pick it up. And again, it's used for maritime safety predominantly. It's used for navigation on ships. So you're sending a signal out into the world, and then anyone else who cares to receive it can collect it and save that data. And there's reasons you may care about that besides the environment. But what Global Fishing Watch realized is that they could take this information and they would purchase it from these private companies that have been saved on servers and databases somewhere. And then they could convert it to useful information about the environment. Now, I'll show you an example of how these data, I'll show you two examples, in fact, how these data can be used to maybe answer interesting environmental questions and make us better informed about environmental policy. So right now, all the data are being hosted by Global Fishing Watch and Google. Almost all of it is publicly available. And again, the idea here is to take what has been for too long out of sight, out of mind, and put it in the hands of researchers and the general public in order to better understand their world. And so this project that I'm talking about now here, Blue Paradox, is just one example of, I guess nearly 100 papers by now that have been made with these Global Fishing Watch data. So, and I'll show you another repository or resource for accessing environmental data in a second. Also, it just happens to be hosted by Google, but there's many different places that are doing this now. Planet, a lot of different satellite companies in particular. Okay, so that's a bit of a long segue on Global Fishing Watch and machine learning in general.
Well, another question that kind of fits right in there is, do you think technology advancements are going to be better or worse for the environment?
That's a great question, and it's one I would probably ask at the end of this lecture. So I think there's promise and peril. I am quite nervous in a sense about a lot of the privacy issues associated with, constant monitoring. Every square meter of this earth is going to be photographed, recorded by satellites up in the air at least once a day from now on, and probably becoming more and more frequent. And there's obvious, concerns about that, being able to track individuals, monitoring faces, infringement of rights and so forth. But if I just had to think about, and also cell phones. So cell phone data are available and researchers are using them now, and we can track individuals. We may not know who they are at first blanch when we get a record of where they're moving, but we can see that, for example, this cell phone signal every day at 5 o'clock returns to this address. And it doesn't take much work to work out who owns that house. And then you can, match an individual, a named individual with a particular set of movements. And you may find out, hey, this individual was at the Capitol on the 6th of January. And, so there's positive sides to that. And there's also potential downsides. From a from an environmental standpoint, though, I think the upsides far outweigh the downsides. And I kind of said this already, but for too long, many of the things that have been happening to our environment have been out of sight, out of mind. And they've been too far for from the people to care, to even to track. And now, because we have this raft of valuable information from things like satellites, we can see environmental change happening before our eyes, at least on our computer screen. And we're now in a position to actually make informed decisions about how and what to do about it. So I think from an environmental standpoint, the answer is very much positive, although I think there are some concerns we might have about satellite or monitoring in general. And things like machine learning. These algorithms can kind of, there's a lot of psychological tricks that they can exploit that we're not even aware of. So they just maximize some objective. I'm going really off piece now from the topic, but it's the brave new world that we're entering into. And so I think as much as possible, let's try and use these tools for good. And the environment is one case where we could think about doing that. Okay, so let's get back to this blue paradox. This is this paper we were talking about. And again, we're focusing on this area here in the equatorial Pacific, as I said, just sort of northeast of Australia. And the area we're going to look at, hopefully you can recall from that map that we saw, this almost this square looking, slightly off square looking polygon in red. And what we are going to do in this paper is we use the fishing activity that we are tracking on Global Fishing Watch. We're going to compare what we see in this red area to two control regions. And I could talk about why we select these control regions. There's valid reasons for that. But again, we're trying to think about, in empirical research, we often try and think about a counterfactual. You know, what would happen if this policy didn't happen? And that's really tricky to do. But in this case, we can make a reasonable assumption that these two regions are a reasonable counterfactual of how fishing would have evolved in this red area, Pippa, if the marine reserve hadn't been created. Okay, so let's have a look at the main results of the paper. This blue region is just fishing effort over time, aggregated in that whole blue region that we saw previously. So this is all the fishing effort in these two blue regions. This is the line you see over here. Okay, now there's two things I want to show you before I go to the next slide. The first is this dotted line is when the marine reserve actually went into place. And we already know what happened here when we saw that video. Fishing just totally collapsed. So it was a success in that sense, unambiguously. But what we are interested in, is there a change in fishing activity as kind of word got out that this Pippa was going to be closed? Do we see a divergence in fishing activity in Pippa relative to this blue line? And this second vertical line, this solid one, is the first study or news article, I should say, that we could find mentioning the eventual marine closure. So you can think of this as when news started to get out about Pippa actually was going to be enforced. They were going to create this marine reserve, this national park at sea. And so here's the results. You can see that these two areas are Pippa and then the control region are very closely aligned. Just lo and behold, up until the point that word starts to get out about the eventual closure of that region. And then what do we see? We see a really significant increase in fishing activity in Pippa relative to our control region. So again, you can think about this as a counterfactual. What would have happened in another state of the world where we didn't announce the marine reserve? And then afterwards, absolutely, fishing collapsed. But what we're interested in now is quantifying how much damage was done over here, where all this extra fishing occurred. See, fishing is so much higher here in Pippa than the control region. How much damage would happen here relative to how long it would take to recover that from the eventual shutdown? And sorry, Laura, question?
Oh, no, I'm just fascinated.
Sorry, I'm glad. So this is the answer to that question. We can actually, in mathematics, we would say we integrate under the curve. This is just, counting up all the area underneath here and then making it display over here on the other side. So these two gray areas are equivalent. They have the same amount of fishing or lost fishing. And it turns out that the break-even period for all the extra fishing that was done over here would take about 1.5 years of the ban to undo. Okay, so this is the summary of that paper. Again, we used this really cool satellite-based data to kind of make this decision, or to run the study. This study would have been impossible 5 years ago, but now because we have the data, we can do things like this. So the summary version is that these fishes more than doubled their effort leading up to the closure of this marine reserve, and it was about the equivalent of 1.5 years of banned fishing. And you can think about it this way: it would take at least 1.5 years of the policy being in place before it even breaks even. There are some, I think, powerful arguments to be made that it could be longer than that. You know, we could have, in this ramp up in fishing activity, we could have created irreversible habitat loss or things like that. So anyway, and the point here is that there's, if I'm going back to the theme of my talk about environment and the economics, is that even well-intentioned policies can lead to bad outcomes. So these policymakers, they, I think, had a sound idea, and certainly their hearts were in the right place. They wanted to protect this pristine environmental, this pristine environmental region. But because of the rollout of the policy, even though it's, you know, hard to think of an alternative, it created these incentives at the individual level, which can lead to some bad outcomes, or at least suboptimal outcomes at the societal level. And I think the lesson for me here is that when we're designing environmental policies, we really need to think about the economics. We need to think about human behavior and incentives. And there's, I think, some other interesting scientific offshots of this kind of idea, which we can save for the end of the talk if there's time. But right now, I think that's the capstone idea that I want you to take home is like, when we design environmental policy, we need to think about the economics to achieve our goal. And there's other examples of that, and I'll name one very briefly. So the title of our paper is The Blue Paradox. It's a play on a wider idea in economics called the green paradox, which is essentially the same thing, that we can cause environmental harm through well-intentioned environmental policies. And one that many people will tell you about is that the Endangered Species Act. So I'm sure many of you will have heard of the Endangered Species Act. If a species gets listed, no one can harm its habitat anymore. So there's famous cases like the condor, for example. These are critically endangered species. We need to protect them. But what happens in some cases, at least in the Endangered Species Act, is that species were listed and they were announced ahead of time. So, you know, before the policy went into place, protecting all the habitat for the species. And so what happened was, in the case, for example, the red cockaded woodpecker, it's a type of bird in the Carolinas. The species got listed, and then landowners who had habitat that was favorable to breeding colonies and pairs of this bird, they decided, man, I've got to harvest all my trees. I've got to cut down all my plantations, because if these birds nest in here, if they start, you know, if there's a nesting pair, I'll never be able to use this land for economic purposes again. And so it created this perverse incentive again. And so ultimately, once the species got listed, they now had less habitat than they had before, because there was this misalignment with individual incentives with the intended policy outcome.
So what is the takeaway from this? It sounds like such a common theme that human incentives or human behavior and incentives have the same scarcity reaction each of these new policies.
Oh yeah. And there's many other cases besides economics. So in our paper, and you can read the paper, I think it's quite accessible. We name some of them. So there's some famous examples that have nothing to do with environment. So one that's quite shocking is in the aftermath of the Sandy Hook massacre, you know, this terrible tragedy where there was this gunman who went to the school and basically murdered a bunch of kids. It's appalling. Gun sales actually went up in the United States. And the reason is because now there was a strong incentive for, you know, stricter gun control in the US. And so people fearing they would lose access to guns actually went out and bought more guns. And so it had the intention of having I would say a Senate gun policy in the US that led to this perverse outcome. And there's many other cases. So if you want to raise taxes on cigarettes, people end up stockpiling cigarettes. So they go and buy many more cigarettes, and that leads to perverse outcomes. It leads to perverse health outcomes. I could name you many of these cases. I don't think there's a generic answer to each of those problems. It's just you have to think through the incentives when you're creating the policy. So in the case of announcing a marine reserve, for example, it's really tricky because you need a lot of community buy-in, rightfully. You need to have blue ribbon panels, you need to speak to different stakeholders, and that takes a long time. But because of this length of time, and because you don't want to catch people unawares, you may announce it with too much time left. And so one kind of glib answer is you could just shorten the time period between actually formally announcing that there's going to be a marine reserve and enacting it. That could potentially limit some of the harms that we see here. Now, I want to emphasize as well that I've said this, we talk about this in our paper, and I've said this in every radio interview or magazine interview I've ever given about that study, is that it's just one example. And, that's not to say every single marine reserve suffers from this. In fact, there's many reasons to think that they wouldn't, which I haven't really talked about in this video. But still, I think the idea just reinforces what we know from many areas of life, that we need to think carefully about the economics and the incentives. And there's other policy tools at our disposal. So marine reserves have a lot going for them, but it's really interesting that they actually haven't had as good of an effect as many ecologists and biologists have thought. There's a multitude of reasons for that. They may be poorly policed. They may be, put in areas where they couldn't really do much good. And maybe the blue paradox is another one. Maybe the blue paradox is the way we're measuring these reserves after they've started at this kind of impoverished starting point. And we need another 10 years of data before we evaluate how well they do. So that's it. Yeah, go for it.
Just a kind of a off topic, but or your specific blue paradox piece, but there's a question that just helping understand really what just economics is versus environmental economics.
Wow. You've asked an almost impossible question. Economics, one thing that's really interesting to me about economics is that it is such a broad church. There's so many different facets of it. You have monetary economics, financial economics, labor economics, environmental economics, industrial organization, which is about firms and market power and things like that. The common thread they share, I think, is thinking about incentives and allocation of resources. I think that's the common thing they think about. And they think about how actions are communicated through things like prices. And their markets, supply and demand. Now, something that's really interesting to me, and one thing that's drawn me to environmental economics, besides the fact that it just appeals to me naturally in the environment, is that it's an area of economics where the nice world of economics 101, with these perfect supply and demand curves, and we can leave the market to itself. It's an area where the market breaks down most often. And so we really need to think about the tools that we can use to fix that. And, there's many arrows in the quiver of the environmental policymaker. We could think about taxes, and we could think about cap and trade. Some of you may have heard about that. We can think about not having government intervention at all, because maybe government could make things worse. And we've certainly seen that in some heavy-handed cases, like in the former USSR. A lot of nationalized production and decision-making led to really bad environmental outcomes. The Aral Sea is a very famous case. If you look it up, ARAL, completely dried up from overuse and industrial waste. So, we're weighing up all these different kinds of things. So we're trying to think about how to align incentives with these outcomes. And in something like climate change, every single environmental economist I know is screaming for a carbon tax or a cap and trade system. And because we're fixing this market failure and we want to fix this long-term problem that could affect us just because the rules of the game are wrong. Okay. So again, that's one project. And someone asked, what else are these data being used for? Global Fishing Watch. There's tons of other projects. You can go to the website again. It's globalfishingwatch.org. I've got a link to one other recent paper by some friends of mine. It's got a cool video. Global Fishing Watch do a lot of really neat things where they have kind of interactive web pages where you can explore the idea. And the one for this idea is they look at slave labor at sea, which is a real problem. These human rights abuses at sea, where people aren't paid properly and they literally work slave conditions. And they use a bunch of clever techniques, again, using machine learning and some other techniques, and they track that to overfishing. And the idea, very briefly here, and again, I encourage you to look at this excellent video, which will go through it in more depth, which is going to be linked in the slides, is that if we have people working around the clock, working as slaves, they're going to be able to fish more than they would normally, and this is going to create an overfishing problem. So here we have an interesting case where we have two real bads, overfishing and human rights abuses at the high sea, and it turns out that they are related. And if we can fix one of them, we can actually go a long way to fixing another. And that's what a lot of my own research has actually been thinking about as well, trying to look at connections between different types of markets and different types of economic activity, and trying to see whether we can, kill two birds with one stone, so to speak. Okay. We're nearly done for this presentation. I wanted to mention a few other things, just if you're interested in thinking about environmental economics and environmental incentives in general, and environmental data. One really cool thing that I like a lot is Google Earth Engine. I'm sure all of you have used Google Maps before, and Google Earth Engine is like an analytical back end to the stuff that we see there, and it pulls in a bunch of environmental data. And you can do really cool things with it. So I'm going to click on a live session. I think this should hopefully just load a pre-existing script that I've got here. And what this script is going to do, it's going to load a map of San Francisco, and then it's going to run an algorithm behind the scenes, and it's going to try and predict each pixel. It's going to say, is this an urban area or is this an area of greenery? You can do this in many different forms. So you get the satellite data. So here it's busy thinking, and it's classifying it. It's saying, is this a green area? Is this park, or is this actually buildings? And so if you think about all the different applications we could use for this type of technology, we could take satellite images and we could try and get a sense of, how many solar panels there are on roofs of houses. And we could get a sense of how quickly that technology is disseminating. I have another example over here, which I won't open up right now, but it's where we were trying to classify aquaculture. So we'd look at an area of a map, and again, we call it train. So just like I showed you those diagrams of the fishing boats having certain patterns, you'd have to go on here and you'd like click on an aquaculture pen, and you say, oh, that's aquaculture, this is ocean. And, and you would do that lots of times. You'd have to give it lots of data, but then afterward you could just let the machine learning algorithm run, or whatever classification method you want to use, whether it's logistic regression as well or something like that. And it would then be able to take that information, that training knowledge it's got, and then use it in other parts of the world. I'm simplifying, of course, in some sense, because there are a lot of problems, but I just want you to know that there are really some cool tools available to you if you're interested, just kind of exploring. And what's really neat to me, and I know, Laura, you said this in your kind of opening brief for me, I'm a big fan of citizen science and open source tools, because I think improving accessibility and knowledge about our environment is really important. And too often this stuff has been stuck away in an ivory tower somewhere, or you've had to pay an extremely expensive subscription fee for proprietary software. And now the tools that I use are all what we would call open source. Anyone could download them, anyone can run them on the computer. So you don't have to have these massive upfront starting costs. And I think that's really important for encouraging access, not only throughout the US and in poor areas of the US, but in places like I come from, like in Africa and other parts of the world. People should be engaged with their environment, and they should have the tools to do so. Okay, so second last slide, really. I want you to know that there's a ton more happening in the environmental economic sphere here at the University of Oregon. So you've heard me blather now for, I don't know, half an hour or so or longer. But we have fantastic faculty here at the University of Oregon. I'm going to link to the websites, Trudy Cameron, Ed Rubin, Eric Zhu. We also have something called Tweeds that Ed spearheaded, and the rest of us are kind of dragging along on, but it's really cool. TWEED stands for the Workshop in Environmental Economics and Data Science. And a lot of the kind of ideas that I've talked about here are covered at TWEED. So we have a yearly program, people present, and it's all really exciting stuff that's using new technology, new data sets to address these long-standing problems. So again, you could have a look at that. We may start recording the program at some point, but you could go through and click on these individual people and find out some amazing things that are happening, I think, in both the research sphere at universities, but also in the private sector as well. So I encourage you to have a look at those links. Here's one figure that I pulled up from Eric, who's on the bottom here. I love this study. This is forthcoming now in the American Economic Review, which, if you know anything about economics, is like one of the top journals, if not the top. And he did this really cool thing. This figure won't mean much to you, so let me just explain it very briefly. What he did is think about this on the y-axis here. So think about this as the level of pollution. And what happens is there's an agency in the US tasked with monitoring local air pollution. It's called the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. But it turns out, for reasons that I'm not going to get into right now, they only monitor 1 day a week. So this is like a local monitoring station, effectively, and they would monitor 1 day a week. And so what happens is, on the day of the week that pollution gets monitored, lo and behold, wouldn't you believe it, pollution levels really drop off. And so again, we can just think about this. This is an individual incentives. There's a background story here, which is if your pollution levels are too high, the county and the municipality gets punished, not just the polluter. So there's like this nested structure of incentives here. So you can imagine the county commissioner or whoever calling the pollution factory, say, okay, look, today's a monitoring day, you've got to turn off your plant, because we don't want to go into what's called non-attainment. The way Eric does this is really clever. He mixes he uses local station data as well as satellite data to kind of get a counterfactual. But again, you can kind of see this just jumping out in the figure. On the day of measurement, it drops to 0. And this hopefully makes sense to everyone. It's nothing that's outside of our human nature. It's what I would do if I was in that situation, arguably. So that's a cool thing about economics. It tries to bring home some of the intuition we might have, and then actually take that to the data. So that's all I have prepared for today. I will make these slides available. In fact, I'm going to make them here. I'll send Laura a link, and we can maybe add it to the video description, but it'll be on my GitHub page, which is github.com, Grant McDermott, and then /sale. And I'll add a link here to actually accessing the slides and let it play in your browser like this. So I'm happy to field other questions right now.
That's fantastic. You really humanized economics, I think, today. So we have probably only about 2 minutes. So I think maybe one of the most important questions right now is, why do you do this? What do you enjoy about what you do?
That's good.
Everything.
Yeah, my wife's, what you
Everything.
can hear in the background.
Oh,
What I do, so I have an innate interest in the environment. That helps. And many people, there's, as I said, there's different aspects of economics. So many people care about, equality and injustice, and they might be drawn to labor economics, and they want to see if there's racial discrimination in the workplace, or if there's gender discrimination, or they care about having a stable economy, and they might be drawn into macro. But for me, the environment was a natural starting point. uh, I I love the tools that I use. I love using the software that I use. I like coding and data science. I didn't know that at all. If you told me that when I was 18 years old, I would have laughed at your face, in your face, and maybe given you a wedgie. But here I am, and I get to use these cool tools, and I actually I like taking all this information, trying to synthesize it, and then presenting it to the public. I get a lot from that, and I like something that's cool about the environmental economics, and also again thinking about, in my case, thinking about software. It's nice to see people feel empowered. There's a lot of positive spillovers from that. And you can get many of the same things. You don't have to be an academic to do it. I think there's a lot of really exciting careers for people who have some training in economics and econometrics, or similar tools, and you can apply them widely in industry too. So I think that's kind of what drives me.
that's a fantastic answer. All inclusive. We can tell from your enthusiasm that you're really, really enjoy what you do. Well, Grant, we are out of time today, and this was just a fantastic opportunity for our students to have this information, and your message about how accessibility is it's possible in this field, and you really opened our eyes. So thank you very, very much for volunteering your time to be with us today, and we
Well,
will be
thank you for having
posting your
me.
information.
I'm a huge fan of SAIL. I'll say it again, and I look forward to seeing at least some of you enrolled in university proper in years to come.
Yes, awesome. Well, thank you again, Grant.
Thanks,
Enjoy the
everyone.
rest of your day.
Bye bye.
Bye.